over, and if you could please record.
Sorry, Mark. I should have interrupted a minute earlier, but from the top. Thank you.
No worries. Yeah, just, Ian, are you ready?
You are live. Go ahead.
Okay, great.
We're recording now.
Okay, thank you. Yes, my name is Mark Henderson. I'm a civil engineer with Melior Design, and we are consultants for Radnor Township, and we've been working on several projects in the township, with the West Wing Preserve Stormwater Management Project being one of them. And we just wanted to provide an update today to the neighbors of the project and other folks in the township on where we stand on some of the active portions of this project, and also the overall flood reduction study that we're conducting in the Little Darby Creek watershed. Just to begin with the update on where we stand as far as West Wing Preserve and the Friends of Radnor Trail Park. Last fall, we gave a presentation letting the public know where we were with this project at that time. And we have some updates, some additional information, and we just wanted to start a presentation with that, and then move on to the bigger overall study that we've been conducting in the overall watershed. So as you can see on this screen, West Wing Preserve is about 7.8 acres. It's a township-owned property adjacent to the Friends of Radnor Trail Park. And we've been asked to look at the stormwater management potential for these two properties to improve downstream conditions with respect to flooding and stormwater management in general. When we look at the drainage area to these two parcels, we've kind of highlighted them in these funky colors. And you can see to a great extent around these properties, a lot of water makes its way either through West Wing Preserve or the adjacent park. All of this water ends up discharging to conveyance to Little Darby Creek to the south in this general area here. The goals of our project as far as these two properties are concerned started out as improving stormwater management potential, increasing the habitat value within the West Wing Preserve, providing passive recreational opportunities as they would allow, and reduce downstream flooding, and improve existing township amenities. And so we'll kind of talk about some of those points in the next several slides. This slide shows the two properties, the two township properties, with West Wing Preserve being at the top of the page, and the Friends of Radnor Trail Park being to the south. As you can see, it's a little hard in black and white, but these areas I'm circling with my mouse are delineated wetlands. And this is some of what we've updated our plan with moving forward. We did have the Army Corps of Engineers confirm a lot of the wetland boundaries as part of our preliminary jurisdictional determination.
Can I just interrupt you, because I didn't see anything circling on my screen. I don't know.
Sorry. Yeah, no problem. I don't know if my mouse, that's helpful if my mouse isn't visible. So
yeah, I don't think your mouse is being shared.
Okay.
The image is, but not the mouse. So I don't know if there's a screen pointer or something that's in the software that would help you to do that.
Laser pointer?
Yeah, I can see that.
Okay, there is. That was a good tip. I don't use Zoom that much. The wetland areas of West Wing Preserve are shown by delineating this line here. In general, it's the low-lying area in here, but it does go up a slope. There are some palustrine wetlands in this area, and then there are mounds of soil here and here that create more upland that are not delineated as wetland. And there's also upland all around the edge. And that'll come into play in our next slide. Move to that. As you can see, if you were aware of our plan previously, we've shrunk a lot of our proposed work in this area to avoid wetland impacts to a great extent, to basically de minimis conditions, while still keeping the benefits of the overall project. So this dark dashed line here is our new limit of disturbance, with pockets of work within those mounds that also avoid any wetland impact, so that we're reducing those mounds down to a more consistent condition with the surrounding area, and also reducing some of the grades in these areas to provide more volume and more storage within this area, while also limiting the amount of water that flows outside down South Devon Avenue from the property, and also making a connection to this inlet on the corner of Conestoga and South Devon, and bringing much of that water into West Wayne Preserve, because we noticed that has a dramatic effect on the flooding condition down the road. Most of this change took place as a conversation with DEP and the Army Corps of Engineers, so we thought it was a much more beneficial solution that everybody was agreeable to. As far as what we propose to take place in the Friends of Radnor Trail Park, it's all subsurface storage. Let me go to the next slide because it's a blow up, I believe. Oh, no, it's not. I'll go back. In general, it's subsurface stormwater storage, much more heavily focused on stormwater management from the adjacent neighborhoods, instead of more of a natural habitat restoration that we would see here that has also that stormwater benefit. The next slide is more of a blow up of what we would be talking about in West Wayne Preserve, specifically with the grading that would take place, and also the tree plantings that would take place. It would be planted back to a more natural and native condition after the project is built.
So all the existing trees and foliage would need to be removed to do this?
So in these areas of disturbance, yes. In the areas outside of the limit of disturbance, we would be proposing also, we have another slide, we would be proposing also to eliminate invasive species or undesirable species like ash trees that, if they aren't dead already, will be dead soon after. And this project also, we've talked to Steve about it, but it is going in front of the Shade Tree Commission as well. So there will be some coordination with the township with respect to that. And so Steve might be able to talk a little bit more to that point. But yes, if it is an area that has earth disturbance and grading within it, all the trees would be removed, and we would be replanting as part of a planting plan. As you can see from this image, this is the extent of what we would like to replant as far as a native species planting plan, to provide more of a restoration habitat for the entire property. As you can see, it extends to different areas than the grading and the actual disturbance, but because planting and invasive removal isn't considered disturbance by regulating agencies, the project boundary can be more extensive than the actual disturbance and grading limits for the project.
Just another question. There's deer bedding in there. Would that be removed, or would that stay?
I think that would be up for discussion. Obviously, this entire plan is something that we have to to coordinate further with the township and others. So if there were things that that we should consider beyond what we have already, we're open to that.
Can I just interrupt for a minute? Are we asking questions now, or are we going to ask questions at the end? Because I thought we were going to hold off asking questions, but just tell me, what's the process? How do you want to?
Whatever makes you comfortable. If you don't mind waiting to the end, that's fine. If you want to jump in while the slide is up, that is fine also.
Okay. Can we go back to that slide you just had up there then?
Yep.
In the middle of that drawing, it says, looks like spillway, and then
Here or here?
what is that dark rectangle right underneath your?
Right here?
Yeah.
That's basically a erosion control blanket. So what we have is the pipe coming in, the existing pipe coming in. We're expanding the area where the pipe discharges. The pipe discharges is moved further away from the wetlands, and we're creating a forebay to allow for easier maintenance and removal of sediment as it comes in, so that we don't have to go into the wetland area to do any kind of stormwater maintenance. That was a request from DEP and the Army Corps. So this becomes forebay for settling of solids, and then the overflow is being protected here as water then enters the larger area.
And is there some sort of a discharge point at the southern end of that containment area?
There's an existing pipe through the old railroad embankment that runs along the trail, and we would be upgrading that structure and the pipe that goes through the embankment as part of the project. So
upgrading it meaning what?
Well, right now it's a buried culvert that doesn't provide much function, and that's why much of the flow goes around and down South Devon Avenue. So it would be formalized as a overflow structure designed to maintain not only a specific elevation of water in this area, but also manage storm discharges essentially.
And where would the water go that goes into that culvert that we're talking about?
It goes into the same drainage that the culvert discharges into now, which I can show you on a different plan if it's helpful.
Sure.
Let me see. So let me go up a slide or two. Let me go back. Here's a blow up. Essentially, the water from West Wayne Preserve ends up in this ditch or channel that then continues on page south to the Little Darby Creek in a series of ditches and culverts that go under several of the roads, and we'll see those maps later. So I have a few maps and further slides that we can talk about the overall drainage from this area.
Yeah, I believe that is the source of the water that goes into the little stream. The stream that bisects my property, the Hobson's property, the Canalia's property, and some other properties, the Leemings, I think. We live on Arbordale Road, and they live on Oakford, right off of South Devon. And hopefully we'll get to that point at some point in this discussion. Yes. But we are dealing with, in my opinion, a situation where the existing culvert that goes underneath Arbordale Road is being overwhelmed by drainage coming from upstream, such that it doesn't function. It becomes a bottleneck and floods our properties and our basements and causes, major damage and headaches. And I'm a little bit
If I
concerned.
can add, before we get too deep, Mark is going to address that culvert. We had asked him specifically about that. So that is coming up. If I could ask if we could let him progress, because he will
Sure.
land on that culvert.
Okay. Yeah. I guess the only point that I wanted to focus on was, we're having a problem now, and if you're going to, open the spigot, so to speak, upstream with that culvert that's currently not functioning, I guess I would like for all of us to be aware of what the consequences of that may be.
And I'm just going to be able to show you that graphically later on.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, yes.
Hey, Steve and Mark. Steve, could you just kind of go over some of the criteria that we laid out when we started looking at this plan, with the priority being that anything we do in the West Wayne Preserve cannot provide it can't create more problems for the people downstream.
Correct, Commissioner. So any stormwater management project the township takes on, first and foremost is we cannot solve one problem and create another. So any consultant that works for the township, and in this case, Melior Design, is fully aware of that. We can't take care of one issue, but exacerbate an issue for someone downstream. And as a commissioner noted, and what Mark is going to show you graphically a little later is the existing conditions along all the various creeks in a certain storm without any interventions from a stormwater management standpoint. And then he will also show you what happens sequentially in each of those storms. So you'll be able to see by the colors on the slide what is happening down by your house.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah, that's the majority of the presentation, I would say. Just going through the entire Little Darby Creek drainage, but yeah, that's a good background. We just wanted to definitely catch everybody up on where we stood on this particular project before moving into the nitty-gritty details of the rest of the study. So let me skip ahead a little bit, just to give folks a little bit of a conceptual overview of what would happen in the Friends of Radnor Trail Park project as far as we've laid it out now. These areas of rectangles are basically subsurface stormwater storage that would allow this park to be maintained as it is as far as function goes, but provide a lot of online storage for water that would actually typically end up in the drainage ditch that then makes its way around the park and south to the properties we were just talking about. So that basically collects much of the water around where the railroad crossing is, and before it actually gets to the railroad crossing and causes flooding here under the railroad bridge, collects it in the streets, brings it through to our system, stores it and holds on to it, and then allows it to either infiltrate into the soil or slowly discharge out depending on soil conditions, which we expect because of the high water table in this area. We're going to see a limiting ability to infiltrate water, but we're providing static storage in this area in order to hold on to that water and then just slowly release it out. And so you will see a reduction in water that makes its way into that conveyance to the north and west of the park.
Is this similar storage to like what was done under the playing fields at the middle school?
Same concept, probably a different product, but same concept, yes.
So if I can add, and Mark just touched on it, could you go back one slide, Mark, to the one you were just at? So just to make everybody understand, I'm sure everyone is aware of the flooding that goes on under the bridge, and Mark touched on that. So part of the project is to reduce that flooding. Doesn't go away, but it is. So we call all our projects flood reduction projects, right? It reduces the probability of flooding, does not make it go away. But this half of the project through the Friends of the Radnor Trail Park, there will be inlets and piping installed to address that, to collect that water. And as you proceed left into what is now the gravel parking lot, that would actually be porous paving. So it serves two purposes. It would be paved, which, you know, maybe hopefully you would think would be nicer, but it will be porous paving. So the runoff that hits that parking lot is going to go down into that system also. So that's a way of controlling that lot, because as it sits right now, even though it's stone, that lot is considered impervious. Water runs off it. With the porous paving, we're going to manage that lot up to a certain amount. And then as you proceed left to the next system, as Mark said, all of this is subsurface. So in the letter that we sent out, we noted that, yes, we're going to disturb the park, but when we're done, no usage of the park changes. So when we're done, everything's underground. We have nice grass and all back and a nice parking lot. So I just wanted to make sure folks didn't worry about that. Sorry, Mark.
No worries. The next couple of slides are tied mostly to the West Wayne Preserve and Friends of Radnor Trail park projects. We brought them a little bit to the top as far as information goes in the presentation. So this is a diagram from our stormwater model that looks at flooding and flood depth for the Little Darby Creek drainage area. And as you can see, the blue areas are shallower flooding, and then red areas are obviously deeper flooding. And you can see, you know, obviously along the Little Darby Creek channel, you get much deeper flooding. Within, West Wayne Preserve proper, you have some storage and ponding as well in the existing condition, but you also get a lot of water running down South Devon Avenue. And yes, there is, you know, flooding amongst the homes all the way down into this area as well of Arbordale. So this is the existing condition, and I'm going to kind of toggle back and forth. When we add West Wayne Preserve and the Friends of Radnor Trail storage into the mix in our model, you can see the reduction in little hexagons that represent the reduction in flooding. Let me toggle back and forth. It's the easiest way you can see some of the reduction. And like the commissioner said, we're conscious of, you know, this conveyance and not making things worse. So that's something that as we, you know, move forward in the project, and we'll review it more in more detail. And so far, we don't believe we're making things worse along the conveyance. But that's 100% something that we're paying attention to.
Mark, excuse me, could you explain what the 10-year 1-hour storm is, like how much rain it is in an hour? It's one of these microburst kind of storms with a lot of water.
Yes. So essentially the storm, and I kind of skipped over this a little bit in the beginning because we haven't gotten into a lot of the flood study, but we are primarily focusing on short duration, high intensity storms for what goes into our model. So it's a 10-year 1-hour storm. So it's a 10-year recurrence over a 1-hour period. And the depth of rain is approximately 2 hours or 2 inches in that 1-hour time frame, which is a very high intensity storm. And it's not the total depth of some of the storms we've been experiencing recently that we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. But as far as intensity and ability to cause flooding within Radnor Township, it's fairly consistent with a lot of the storms that cause problems in this area. It's also a storm that's been used in other studies, so it's a consistent metric in a lot of ways. Even though I know there are when you look at the total duration of storm depths, the overall storm may have a little bit more rain to it, but the high intensity volume that you get within this 1 hour time frame is what really causes the flooding in much of Radnor Township, in this area and in other areas too.
Would it be possible to help us understand that concept by comparing it to what we experienced early August? I think it was August 4th. I think that was the byproduct of that hurricane that I can't pronounce the name of that came through the area.
Aisa, so I'm going to jump in on that one. So Mark described that 10-year 1 hour scenario, 2 inches of rain in that hour is a very intense storm, but it is not the equivalent of that tropical storm. So I do want to make sure everybody understands when we get storms of that magnitude, and I don't want to say that, boy, we're never going to get it again, because it seems like every August, at least, we get something like that. We had one the previous year that deluged Wayne. We had that one. We had one in Newtown Square of similar effect. So just so everybody understands, none of the interventions we're proposing, and no township's stormwater infrastructure or stormwater management is able to handle a storm of that magnitude, right?
But can you quantify the magnitude? Just I don't have any concept.
Sure. So we design. So when you build a house, a brand new house, you're going to be required to commit to build it to our stormwater management ordinance, and that's going to be for up to a 100-year event storm, a storm that has a 1% chance of happening in a year. Now, that doesn't mean it never happens. Obviously, it does. So I don't know the exact number, but I can tell you a tropical storm or remnants of a hurricane are greater than that. So those are, for lack of a better term, anomalies that our current or proposed infrastructure cannot handle. And that's the same.
Can I jump in real quick?
Sure.
Just 'cause I struggle with when we talk about these year storms and how much rain that actually is. I think I heard Mark mention that the storm that you're modeling to would be 2 inches in 1 hour.
Correct.
Yes.
The tropical storm that hit us in early August dropped roughly 7 to 8 inches in about a 10-hour window. So if that helps, it helped me kind of conceptualize or picture exactly what we're talking about here. I mean, the amount of rain, basically over or about an inch an hour for 8 to 9 hours is much more significant than the storm that we're talking about here.
Yeah, and I think, and I have some, well, I don't have them too soon in the presentation. Typically, when we talk about rainfall and intensity and things like that, if you have, like the manager was saying, if you have, a tropical system or a hurricane, a lot of times you'll experience a tremendous amount of rainfall over a long period of time, and that is typically in the half an inch an hour to an inch an hour intensities during that storm. So the other day, depending on which gauge you look at, my area might have gotten 4.5, 5 inches over a 6-hour period, but there were times within that storm that were much closer to this 10-year 1 hour storm where the intensities within that storm crept up. And so what typically causes flooding in Radnor are really high intensity, short duration storms. And so 2 inches coming down on impervious areas in a 1 hour span is what creates the creeks to rise rapidly and areas to become inundated with runoff. when you have a much longer duration storm, that volume is able to pass through the system over that time, and you don't see nearly as much of a surge, and the flooding is not as apparent because the system, the conveyance system and the creeks are able to pass that water through over a greater period of time, if that kind of helps.
Yeah, I appreciate explaining that.
Yeah, and you know, it's what we usually, when we talk to folks, it's not the 30 hours of rain from a hurricane that always cause flooding in Radnor. It's a lot of the microbursts or the short duration storms to where, you know, it rains just in the morning and you have flooding. And that's kind of what happened on August 4th. It wasn't, at my house at least, it was about 6 hours of rain with periods of very high intensity rainfall. And, you know, as soon as it stopped raining, you know, much of the water disappeared quickly, but it was enough to cause inundation in a lot of areas, for sure. As far as our overall study goes, we've looked at the entire Little Darby Creek drainage all the way to Mill Dam, and that focuses much of the area in not only Tredyffrin and Easttown, but you know, also obviously Radnor. But this diagram is pretty important as far as the concept goes, because the heavy line is the Radnor Township line. A lot of you folks are obviously in this area of the drainage. And so what you can see is that there's not a whole lot of area between where you folks experience a lot of the flooding and inundation, like the conditions that obviously bring us here to talk about it, and the township line. And so that becomes kind of an important theme as we talk about things as we move forward with the information that we put together. We kind of jumped ahead a little bit, but these were some of the storms and time periods that, you know, we just went back and just pulled some dates off of social media, obviously. And we're talking, you know, the June 3rd derecho, the July 10th tropical storm, and then the August 4th tropical storm. And the August 4th tropical storm was one that, you know, I personally experienced in about 6 hours. By the time I, you know, was up and it was daylight, it was raining, and by noon my power was out and it had stopped raining. And so, you know, although these types of depths show up on a rain gauge for a total storm total, if you experience, you know, the higher intensity portions of it in this, it may rain at ½ an inch an hour for a couple of hours, peak at 2 inches an hour, and you get, you know, much more of a flooding condition. If that depth is spread out over a longer period of time, you may not experience nearly as much flooding or any flooding at all. We talked a little bit about, you know, 100-year storms. And so we wanted to include this diagram just because it gives a little bit of context about Little Darby Creek and the next figure we're going to show. And it has to do with, you know, the 100-year floodplain, which is basically the flood elevation of the 100-year storm that has a 1% chance of occurring at any given year. And like Steve said, that doesn't mean it happens every 100 years. It is just a 1% chance of it happening in any given year. So you can have 3 of them in 1 year. It's just statistically your odds are much lower to experience one. And then the 500-year flood event is more of like a fringe flooding, and it's a 0.2% chance of occurring in a given year. So this is FEMA's floodplain map overlay on our drainage maps. So you can see the the blue that traverses the center of the FEMA map is the floodway. So that's the very middle of the stream or the channel, and everything directly adjacent to the stream. The yellow areas are that 100-year floodplain, which has the 1% chance of an annual occurrence. And then the purplish magenta areas on the fringes would be the 500-year or the 0.2% annual chance flood. And so what you'll notice is, obviously much of the areas that you probably experience some flooding are within this 100-year floodplain. And so that you're within that 100-year occurrence interval. So it's an important thing to understand, because our flooding analysis lines up somewhat with the 100-year floodplain, but it also brings in much of the surface flooding that is experienced because of drainage issues and different things like that within the township.
Could you please, just for everybody, so there's some really big bump outs on that. Could you zoom in a little bit on Arbordale? Because that's a lot of the folks that are on here from that. And I think it's important to show what that yellow is and what the 100-year floodplain is based on your mapping. So folks,
these are FEMA delineated areas. And so this is the Arbordale region broken out as far as FEMA has modeled it. And FEMA looks at the mainstream channel and what comes to it as far as drainage within the watershed. And they model all the structures, bridges and things like that along the way. And so yes, these yellow areas are the 100-year floodplain. And so that would be, where FEMA designates flooding to occur.
So if you happen to be situated in the middle of that 100-year floodplain, can your flood mitigation efforts ever make a significant impact in reducing the flooding if you're in that 100-year floodplain?
That's a good question, and that's kind of the theme of some of the further slides, or some of the slides further into the presentation. The drainage, I don't want to give away the punchline, but the drainage to these areas at West Wayne Avenue here, South Devon Avenue at the bridge, those are pretty big drainage areas with a large amount of volume reaching them. And so what we're finding is that it is difficult to impact this main channel because much of the drainage comes from tritiferin. It comes from a very large area and concentrates into the Little Darby Creek floodplain, essentially. And so we'll look at some of those things and compare some numbers just to give you more context, I think, and hopefully that'll be helpful. I'll cruise through these pretty quick, but they'll just add to the context. As you can see, the blue area is what drains to the South Devon Avenue Bridge, right adjacent to Warren Philippone and Beauconnor Park, right where my pointer is. It's about 644 acres. As you can see, a vast majority of it is in Tritiferin or Easttown Township. And so the adjacency to tritiferin is pretty important, because once water crosses the township boundary, it's pretty much in the main channel already. So we'll kind of go through that with some of the flood mitigation that we modeled as well. As you can see, the next drainage to West Wayne Avenue is another 220 acres. And then further down to Mill Dam, all the way to the bottom, is another 200 acres as well. So that's about 1,070 acres of drainage for this entire area that reaches Mill Dam. As far as impervious percentage, the 644 acres to South Devon Avenue Bridge is about 42% impervious and 268 acres. The section that's 220 acres is about 40% impervious, and you have much less impervious in the last section of drainage just upstream of Mill Dam. So as you can see, like, you have a very high density of impervious before you even get to your neighborhood, and it is like you said, you're already in the 100-year floodplain area. It is hard, and we'll talk about some of the interventions in a few slides. What we looked at was not only the first scenario we showed earlier in the slide presentation with West Wayne Preserve and the Friends of Radnor Trail Park BMPs, but we also looked at a few other BMPs just to see what the flood reduction benefit would be, and those are large subsurface storage facilities underneath like sports fields. So essentially, you put a clean material with void space underneath your sports area, and then put it back so that it's usable again. That's kind of the concept we were using. This is the 10-year 1-hour storm existing before any interventions are put in place. And obviously this is what we looked at before with just these two interventions noted. As you can see, this drainage to that culvert that was mentioned under Arbordale is about, it contributes about 640,000 cubic feet of runoff to the system, and we're capturing about 150 cubic feet of that within West Wayne Preserve and also the Friends of Radnor Trail Park subsurface storage. So that accounts to about 23% of a volume reduction, making its way down to that culvert in Arbordale. When you look at the existing versus subsurface storage added in that would be placed under these parks, you can see you get the benefit from having obviously those West Wayne Preserve and Friends of Radnor Trail parks, but you don't see a lot of difference between the main channel. And this, as I toggle back and forth, there are some pixels that change, but you see a lot of the same drainage conditions in and around Little Darby Creek. Most of that, in our opinion, is attributed to the size of the drainage coming to these areas versus the size of the BMPs that we proposed. And we were proposing two practices, two stormwater facilities that took up much of the open space upstream of the South Devon Road Bridge, and yet we were only able to capture about 120 cubic feet versus the almost 3.5 million cubic feet of runoff that are generated up until that point at the South Devon Bridge. And so because you're only capturing about 3% of the runoff volume making its way to that bridge, that's why we think we're not seeing as much flood reduction in the previous slide as we did for just the BMPs at West Wayne Preserve and the Friends of Radnor Trail Park, because your percentages are just not as favorable.
So Mark, just to make sure everybody understands, if the projects, based on your design calculations, if the projects at West Wayne Preserve and Friends of the Radnor Trail Park were completed, there's a 23% reduction in runoff on the 10-year 1-hour event to the Arbordale area. Add the projects, which is a 23% reduction. the projects at the parks provide only a 3% reduction to that area.
Yes, approximately the South Devon Bridge. That's where we drew our drainage area to.
Got you. Thank you.
So just upstream. Yep. And these are a couple slides that show the extent of the area that we're managing, and the approximate footprint that we estimated. And so you can see the orange area is the size of the stormwater facility below ground, and the drainage area that's contributing. And just to be clear, the limiting factors for both of these parks is the elevation of the ground below the surface and where you would be conveying the water to. You can't put it too far down into the ground, otherwise you can't get the water out into the stream in the future. And so this is the Warren Philippone sized system, which is a little bit larger, and it takes much more drainage, but combined they were only about 120 cubic feet worth of runoff. So when you look at them in total, and this is a table that looks all the way down to the mill dam area, so it does include the entire study area that we were looking at. We get about 5 million cubic feet of discharge out of the Little Darby Creek system, and we're able to capture about 150,000 at the West Wayne Preserve Friends of the Radnor Trail BMPs in this area, and then about 120 below the sports fields. In total, it ends up being about 5% of a volume reduction as a whole for the entire drainage area. But as we kind of highlighted before, the two projects that are in design right now have a much bigger impact to the specific drainage that they are sitting in. And that kind of led us to the punchline we talked about earlier, and that's that it's going to be very difficult for us to, with the limitations of where a lot of the drainage is coming from, it's going to be really difficult for us to propose big enough projects to reduce some of the main channel flooding. But we do want to take a closer look at very targeted site-specific areas for flood reduction due to what we saw closer to, related in type to what we saw up at the West Wayne Preserve area, in that there are some inlets that don't have capacity. You get a lot of flooding, jumping curbs and going into areas that water is not necessarily meant to go in. And if we can reduce some of those types of issues, it may make things a lot more bearable in this area. But I think what we figured out from some of the study is some of the larger, more expensive flood control projects or flood reduction projects are not going to have nearly enough benefit for the disruption and the cost. But there is still potential to take a closer look with some feedback from you folks as to where some of the very specific issues are in this neighborhood, and really drill into them and see if we can make some very targeted proposals for changes to either stormwater infrastructure or different things like that.
So I'm going to jump in again. So, like one of the examples was, I've met with residents on Arbordale, and there's a considerable amount of runoff that goes down between the properties and, rear yard to rear yard. And when that gets to the rear yard of some of the folks on Arbordale, the grades that have occurred over the years really stop that flow. So one of the things we're going to look at with Mark is there something we can do back there? Whether it be a swale or pipe, those are those targeted things he's talking about, to see if we can, and that's just an example of one. But we have heard you, I've talked to a lot of folks out there. Just want to make sure You understand we didn't, we're not skimming over that. So you will see us walking around out there. We're going to knock on your door. I've seen a lot of the flooding back there, but nobody knows it better than you. So we will be out, and then we're going to try to see if there are some very specific projects we can do to address some things. And as Mark has shown, there are limits to those projects, but we are going to try.
With regard to, and I appreciate that, Steve, but specifically with regard to that August 4th storm, we took some video of the culvert and the impact upstream on our property and some adjoining properties. Did you folks get a chance to see that video?
So I do have the video, and I do want to, Mark so one of the things was I specifically talked to Mark about that and your concerns with that culvert. So they did do a little work on that. And again, I think we have to put those larger storms into perspective, because in most cases, not all, our infrastructure is not able to handle them. Some are, depending on the specific culvert, some are not. But even our storm sewers, our inlets, on those days when we get those rains, when you see feet of water coming down the street or through the yard, the inlets and the pipe are inundated. Where they outlet to the stream is above their elevation. So nothing is really working well. So we did look at the culvert, and I just want to, it's not a panacea. Usually in those instances, and I'm not going to speak for Mark, there's not just a single item that we can do that's going to relieve flooding. And I think you're going to see, maybe making that culvert bigger might help, but I don't want you to think that even, let's, for the purpose of this exercise, say we triple the size of that, we get another tropical storm like we had on the 4th, that culvert too will be most likely inundated. But I'll toss it back to Mark, because Mark, I know you have some more slides to go through.
Yeah, I think there's a few more. And I honestly don't even, I think we want, like, this was the point where we wanted to, kind of open it up and request some feedback. And I think Steve alluded to it. I think we are going to want to continue with meeting with you folks and getting an idea of where those specific issues are that you see. And I think the combination of upstream improvements to that drainage with the West Wind Preserve group of projects and further evaluation of what is going on in that area, whether it's looking at that culvert or other things, will help. The culverts do become a little bit of an issue because the more water you release through the culvert, it can cause problems downstream. And so that's something that we have to be really conscious of as far as making one adjustment within the drainage having kind of a domino effect further down, because we've had this conversation with other folks in the township. The undersized culverts actually, while they do cause local flooding around the culvert, they also prevent water from reaching further downstream quicker. And so you do, there's a combination of things that are taking place. So you do have localized flooding, but it also provides flood prevention downstream, if that makes sense. So it's not as simple as just replacing the culvert and making it bigger. We have to look at kind of the bigger picture as well before, somebody like DEP would allow that to happen. Because you would have to get a permit.
As part of your big, I'm sorry, did somebody want to jump in? I don't want to monopolize.
I just want to go over a few points because I think it might help folks. So Mark, there's a couple things I'd like to touch on. Items that you said. So there's, for our residents to understand, Mark, could you go back to the slide that shows the drainage area in Tredyffrin, please?
Yeah.
So one of the things Mark noted is that there is a huge amount of runoff that we are getting from outside our political boundary. Even though runoff knows no such boundaries, our ability to affect anything, this is another township in another county, and unfortunately we are downhill, and that is one of the reasons we get the runoff we do. Secondly, Mark had made a statement that the runoff is already in the creek, is already in Little Darby Creek. So what that's saying is, when it comes through Tredyffrin, a lot of that runoff is already in the creek, meaning it's very difficult for us to do an intervention to try to capture that and do something with, specifically. And I just want folks to know that those are two very big factors that make a determination on just what we can. And then Mark, I'd like you to go to the slides to show the effect of toggling back between when you have, if the West Wayne Preserve and Friends of the Radnor Trail intervention was constructed, the before and after, if you will. So folks can, and if you could zoom in on a little bit, and so let's make sure everybody understands this graphic. So if you look to the right on that scale, the red is greater than 1 foot, right? And you can see that follows the stream, means it's flooding more than 1 foot. And you can look at up at the Radnor Trail, up at the Friends of the Radnor Trail, but specifically the West Wayne Preserve, you see red. So Mark, could you go back and forth so people can get an idea of what that reduction does? So here we are in the existing storm. So we've all seen this. Look at the blue coming out of West Wayne Preserve, and it floods South Devon Avenue. And look at it as Mark follows it down to Arbordale, and you'll see, pockets of bright red. So this is a 10-year, 1-hour event with no stormwater management. Now we flip to the next slide, and you can see it addresses the issues on South Devon Avenue, and there is some reduction along that channel that comes down to Arbordale. But if you also notice, it doesn't make it any worse, which was the requirement. And I think what the gentleman was talking about, it is not exacerbating an already problematic issue at Arbordale.
And how did you come to that conclusion? What's the methodology that was used to make these predictions?
All right, I want to go. This thing's still going on.
The methodology of the study, or
how are you concluding that by opening the culvert up at the West Wayne Preserve that's going to drain into this unnamed tributary of Little Darby Creek that goes through our neighborhood and past our houses and
Not what he's saying.
into the culvert there at Arbordale? How are you concluding that you're going to reduce by 23% the impact down there?
let me roll back to the slide with the plan, because it'll be a little bit easier to describe. I think that's probably the best one. So what we've done a few things. One, we've raised the grade in this corner of the property. Currently, the grade goes in this direction, and this is a low point of West Wayne Preserve. So water is able to make its way out the pipe, through the wetlands, and once water gets deep enough in this canal, it then starts to overtop and make its way down South Devon Avenue. What we've done is we've bermed up in our plan this corner and made it so that water has to stay in West Wayne Preserve longer. So ponding in West Wayne Preserve itself has increased. So the duration of water staying in West Wayne Preserve has increased. We've increased the storage capacity by reducing some of these mounds. And we've also not necessarily, we haven't put in an open pipe and allowed anything to go through this pipe. We're putting a structure in to control what is discharged. So that structure at the end is pretty much the most important component, because it meters how much water is discharged at any given time and at what elevation of ponding that discharge takes place. So if it was just a clean open pipe, you would have water, coming out, the discharge from under Conestoga, going through the wetland, and then right out and through the conveyance. And in that scenario, you would be, if you bermed this corner, open this pipe, and just let it free flow out, you would be increasing water going to that unnamed trib. But because we're controlling how water discharges out and increasing ponding over the entire area of the wetland system, and then releasing it slowly, that's how we're able to show that 23% reduction.
And how are you controlling? Is there some sort of mechanical device or something that's going to be at the end of that pipe?
So it's basically a concrete box with a series of holes, if you will, whether it's one large weir at the top, but it controls at what elevation water is able to discharge out that pipe. So let's say the concrete box is 6 feet tall, and then at the 4 foot mark there is a notch cut out. Water would have to pond all the way up 4 feet before it even starts to discharge, and then water would have to pond up even higher than that before it really exceeded like a high flow condition, if you will. So you'd be able to pass high storms, like your 50-year and 100-year storms, over the top of that structure, but it limits the amount of water and increases the amount of ponding in the West Wayne Preserve. So we could talk more offline about the details of what we are proposing for that structure, but that's kind of the mechanics of it. You're changing.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand, the pragmatic effect of what you're proposing. And just to kind of go back to the most recent, storm that we're all familiar with, is there any way that you can articulate what impact the West Wayne project, if it had been in place with that, metered culvert, if that would have done anything to, reduce the amount of downstream flow that we experienced?
Yeah, we can definitely we can put in specific storms into our model. We try not to do that oftentimes, because not everybody agrees on what that storm consisted of. If I look at the nearest USGS gauge and pull the rainfall data, it's not always what everybody else experiences. So we sometimes get ourselves into trouble by pulling the actual rainfall and relating it to a specific event, because our model is obviously, guided by the inputs that you put into it. And so sometimes we while it's a fair representation in a lot of cases, people do tend to look at very specific areas and say, well, I don't see flooding at my property under that scenario, and it was up, in my yard in that area when the storm took place. So
let me interject. So again, my suggestion is that I think we should concentrate on the storms that we have the highest probability of getting, and that's our 1 year, 2 year, 5 year, 10 year. Those are the storms that are most frequent. I don't think it's a fair analysis of any stormwater management intervention when we're talking a tropical storm, because what will happen at one point, just like I had mentioned earlier, everything is going to get inundated at one point in a certain type of storm. So the system may help out, but I would request that you don't judge the effectiveness of the system in the remnants of a hurricane or a tropical storm. The merits of the project are really based on that 10-year, 1 hour, 2-inch rain event, which is a pretty intensive event. And we saw the flooding that occurs with that on the model. So my experience in these storms is I see a lot of stormwater management systems, and they're inundated, they're full. So at that point, they're really not doing anything. And I'm not saying that's the case with this, but I would ask that we really focus on the storms that are more frequent. Not that we might not get that storm tomorrow, I don't know, but that's not the design criteria. It's kind of like saying, I have a pickup truck that can hold a ton in the back. Let's see what it does with 5 tons. Might do okay, it might not, but really that's not what it was designed for. I would request we really focus on the design storms.
No, I understand that, and I agree with what you're saying. However, not being conversant in the the quantification of these storms, and I'm just saying, because we just had this event in August and it's all sort of top of mind. I was interested in knowing, what impact, if any, all of these projects would have on that kind of volume, just because it's something that I can relate to, and I think other folks can as well, because we just went through it.
Can I ask a
I
quick
understand,
question?
but that's I guess what I'm saying is that's everybody lived through that, and it was not a good experience, but that is probably not the storm you should relate to these items. I understand why you would want to. You're like, hey, we just had this and we saw how horrible it was and all the water, but maybe I can get Mark to provide you with some storms that fall into this other category. And that's one of the concerns, sir. So people say, hey, I flood when I get an inch of rain. And Mark touched on this. We look at intensity and duration. Did we get that inch of rain over 4 hours? Was it over an hour? You can get an intensity of 5 inches per hour for a very short period of time, not a whole hour, that causes a lot of damage. And unfortunately, Mark and I and Michelle, we live this stuff. You guys don't. You all have jobs that do not look at rainfall intensity and duration. So I can understand it's somewhat of an abstract concept. But I think what we can do is have Mark give some examples of what a 10-year event is or a 1-year event is based on some rain gauge data that he can pull up, which might make it a little bit more relatable. And I'm not taking anything away from the fact that you just had that, but really that's not what this is. I'll go back to my analogy. I have a 1-ton pickup. We're going to throw 3 tons in the back. Truck might be successful, might not, but that's not what it was designed for. So I don't know that that's a good comparison to really dive into.
Mark, can you go back to the slide that has the colorful lines or the dots along Darby Creek? I can't back.
Let me get to the group of them.
I came in a little late and you probably said where this is happening. Like on this particular slide, where the abundance of, you can see a ball field to the right and then a blue area to lower from, right kind of in that area. Mm-hmm. Are you saying that the proposed underground work to be done is in that blue area?
So the work we're currently designing, like creating construction documents for, is the West Wayne Preserve and the Friends of Radnor Trail Park interventions up in this area. Okay. As part of other studies, we did look at interventions that could be put underneath these ball fields on either side of Little Darby Creek. And that's what we added to the study as additional stormwater interventions to see what the reduction
later on or something.
Yeah, and okay. you could continue to go down that road and say, how many of these can I implement before I start to see a reduction? And what we saw was, because you're down in the 5% of runoff to this area removal, you have to do a lot of work in a lot of different areas before you start seeing that. And so in general, the conclusion was, you know, if you have an issue like your inlet, you know, isn't placed in the right location, or it becomes inundated too soon and you get water running down the road, there may be some very specific things that we can do along the way to help alleviate some specific issues, but you may not impact this main channel and what happens, you know, adjacent to the main Darby Creek drainage. And so if you know, there was a lot of opportunity through this area, and this was the beginning of the drainage, you'd see a lot more of an impact like you have here, because the drainage to this area is much smaller in relation to what's coming to the main Darby, you know, Little Darby Creek.
And has there been any conversations at all with Tredyffrin Township to lessen the load that's falling across the border into Radnor? Or
they, you know, they go through the same thing that, you know, Radnor goes through, as far as they are actively seeking to make stormwater improvements in their own, you know, municipality. They're held up by the same things of aging infrastructure that needs to be replaced just to meet the status quo. You know, making emergency repairs on the back end of like the August 4th storms. They have their own regulatory obligations from the state and DEP that they're working on, just like Radnor has. And so I think it's hard, I think, from our perspective, and Steve touched on it, like, you're in this world where, like, if we called Steve's counterpart in Tredyffrin, which we know him as well, his name is Steve also, Mr. Burgo, he has a lot of the same issues that Steve Norsini does in the township, as far as, you know, where do you put your resources, and where can you make the most impact, and he plays catch up just the same, as far as, you know, having reduced capacity of conveyance, which then causes, you know, flooding on a regular basis in very specific areas, or, you know, even just throughout the township. So
I know Easttown has the same problems, where, you know, it flows downhill, and they have neighborhoods just like this that have the same exact problems. I just am looking at this, and I look at this shopping center that has Kmart and Acme, and I know they've done a lot of changes there, and it just seems like it's the perfect opportunity to either require the owner or get more stormwater management in that a hugely impervious surface that they would. And I know that's not your control because it's in a different township, but it seems like if they know there's a problem there, that maybe they would be able to help address some of that when people are putting in for different permitting.
Commissioner Abel asked us to look at the bigger picture, and we did. And so we looked at more of a distributed runoff volume reduction across Radnor Township and also into Tredyffrin. And what you see is that the base drainage to Little Darby Creek, even if you started managing, you know, big percentages of the impervious areas, it still has just a contributing drainage area that provides a base level of flooding, if you will, or a base level of out of bank condition in a 10-year 1-hour storm. And so we did go through the exercise, and we have other pixelated dotted maps to go along with that would have bored all of you to death. But we did look at it, and that was kind of what fed into the conclusion that the issue when you have 5 million cubic feet of runoff coming to this particular area is that even if you took you know, the Target parking lot and put 250,000 cubic feet of storage in that area, you're still, you know, in the single digit percentages of removal of runoff upstream of some of these, most impacted areas.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate it. I got to run to another appointment, but I just appreciate everything you're doing and the hard work that's going into that.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks.
If I may interject to everybody. So we're on a hard stop in about 5 minutes because we actually have another meeting with the commissioner and other residents. So I would ask if anybody has any questions within the next 5 minutes and hasn't had a chance to ask them, please do. And also, if you wish, you can always email me, snursini@radnor.org, and I will share them with Mark and Michelle, and we will get you answers to the best of our ability. And before I get off, I'll be here. I just want to recognize, so I want to thank Township Manager Bill White, your award commissioner, Jake Abel, for being on the meeting, as well as Michelle and Mark, and Dennis Capella, who's our engineering project manager. So, folks, if anybody has some questions to wrap up the last few minutes, if not, please feel free to email me, and we will get you any answer we can.
Yeah, I'd like to ask one question regarding the Mill Dam Club. Have you guys, as part of your work in this area, had an opportunity to investigate the functionality of the spillway at the Mill Dam Club? Because from having lived in this area for 30 plus years, certainly anecdotally, we have been led to believe that some of the upstream flooding that we've experienced is a byproduct of them not opening the floodgates in anticipation of some of these tropical storms and other storms that were, widely advertised by the weathermen. Have you had a chance to look into that?
We haven't specifically put the operation of the Mill Dam into these models. No, we haven't looked at that.
I would think that is a relevant part of this whole flooding analysis, because again, I think that's another choke point, which causes upstream flooding. And just again, from having lived there, I do recall there was a time when there was supposed to be some sort of an automatic opening floodgate when the pond there reached a certain level. The float was supposed to automatically open the storm gate, and then that didn't work right. So, at some point, neighbors would call the guy who was the manager there and say, we heard on the news there's a big storm coming. Can you make sure that the pond is drained so that the water will drain? So I would think that that's something that needs to be looked at as part of this whole, evaluation in that area. Doesn't that make sense?
Yeah, I can add. This is Dennis. I can add that we have spoken with them many times over the course of the past few storms, and have made sure that their procedure is in place, and they, in fact, even prior to the storm itself, and they seem to be able to do that. Now, I'm not familiar with the automatic capabilities that they have, but I do know that at least manually they do try to go ahead of time, ahead of the storm, to try to make sure that the pond itself is drained and has enough capacity in order to try to reduce the amount of flooding as much as possible. I think, as we've said, some of these storms lately have been even beyond that capability, but we have talked to them, and we will. I'll try to dig into the automatic capability a little bit more myself.
I don't know that there is an automatic capability today.
There is a sluice gate that is. So what happened? It used to be actually manually. It was a screw valve. So sometime that predates all of us on the call, it became a motorized. So instead of having to, try to spin this heavy gate around, it's on a motor that the gentleman used to be Glenn Luce. It's a different guy now. And the swim club does have their own interest at heart in getting that pond down, because when that gets too high, that floods their pool.
Right.
They have an active interest in it. And folks, I'm going to have to say we're going to have to wrap up. We do have another meeting on another topic. So if there's no other questions, please email me, snorsini@radnor.org. We'll get them taken care of for you. I thank you all very much. I know these are odd times, to say the least. Again, I want to thank the commissioner, the manager, Mark, Michelle, Dennis for being on the call, and all you folks for taking time. So this project is still a work in process. We'll be going to the Shade Tree Commission in September to discuss it, but Mark and Michelle are also going to be further refining what they're doing up at West Wayne Preserve and Friends of the Radnor Trail. So any questions, please email, and we will get you answers back. And again, I thank you for taking time out of your day to do this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.